voter-approved Initiative 940, enacted into law in 2019, requires investigations of police use of deadly force to be conducted by an agency completely independent of the one with the involved officers to help ensure impartiality and independence. Upon completion of these investigations by independent investigation teams, known as IITs, and the subsequent legal process, the State Auditor's Office is lawfully mandated to audit each use of deadly force investigation, otherwise known as a UDFI. The Office of the Washington State Auditor was the first state auditor's office in the nation to systematically review every local investigation into police use of deadly force, starting in the fall of 2022, and continues this important work today, having completed nearly 100 audits as of August 2025. Adam Wilson from our office recently sat down with two of our expert UDFI auditors to learn more about these special kinds of audits, the process, and how they benefit Washingtonians.
I'm Adam Wilson with the State Auditor's Office, and I'm going to describe for you a scenario. It's late May 2023 in the evening, and local police are staging outside a retail establishment in search of a man who's suspected of multiple robberies. When that man emerges from the retail establishment, the officers identify themselves and order him to stop. But he runs. While running through the lot, the man reaches into his waistband and pulls out a pistol, at which point the police order him to drop the gun, but he begins to aim the gun. Police open fire, 20 shots are fired, and the man dies on the scene. A team of investigators is brought in to review this fatal incident because someone has been shot and died. Those files are given to the local prosecuting attorney, who, after reviewing them, decides about a year later that no charges will be filed against the officers involved. That is a use of force investigation. After that occurs, we, the State Auditor's Office, become involved. And we're going to talk about how and why with two of our use of deadly force investigation team members, Michael Huynh and Breanna Perry. And can you each introduce yourselves so folks know who they're listening to?
Hi, my name is Michael Huynh. I'm a program manager at the State Auditor's Office. I've been working here for about 12 years now. I first started at the Auditor's Office on the performance audit team. During that time, I worked on a lot of criminal justice-related performance audits. And before that, I had worked on or interned at several public safety agencies, or law enforcement agencies, the King County Prosecutor's Office, FEMA, the CTAC Emergency Management Division, just various things. I've had a key interest in public safety and criminal justice for a while. So when this position opened up, I applied for it and got offered to help start the team.
I'm Breanna, and I'm an assistant audit manager on Michael's team. I've been with the office for about a little over 8 years. After graduating with my accounting degree, I started at SAO, and I actually started on the local government side of things, and I worked in that side of work for about 5 years before this work was required by our office. And so we developed the UDFI team, and Michael came on and kind of started the team, started a couple of those audits, and then actually recruited for a couple more staff members. And so that is when I found the position and transferred over to the UDFI team.
This is a really interesting subject because this team does work that I think is unique in the country. We're safe in saying that we're the only auditor's office in the country that's looking at each and every use of deadly force investigation. Let's talk about how we do that. So let's start with When we audit a use of deadly force investigation, what are the principles involved? What are we looking to see?
Yeah, so in Washington, there's actually specific rules that investigation teams are supposed to follow when reviewing use of deadly force. And there's four main principles that each investigation has to follow. One is independence, and that just means that the agency that employs the involved officer can't be involved in the investigation at all, whether it's actual or just an appearance. The next one is transparency. The investigation needs to be conducted in a manner that allows the public to review it and see that it was done in a trustworthy manner. And then communication is the third one. The investigation team is supposed to communicate to the public about the progress of the investigation and then actually communicate with the family of the person killed or harmed by police use of force. And then lastly, all investigations are supposed to be credible. And that just means that investigations need to follow best practices for criminal investigations and that investigators should be qualified to conduct those investigations.
So to be a trustworthy investigation, I mean, the idea is that we need to know that this was treated seriously and that the death or major bodily harm of someone was properly investigated by law enforcement. Even though law enforcement was involved, we're talking it needs to be independent, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be communicated to everyone, and it needs to be credible. And just the example I gave was from 2023, the case involving Joshua Wilson in Clark County. And in that case, to start off with, they bring in outside agencies through, it's called the Lower Columbia Major Crimes Team, which is, well, you can explain. What are these groups that come in after a use of deadly force?
Yeah, so for that specific incident, the Clark County Sheriff's Office and the Vancouver Police Department were involved in the shooting, and typically agencies within a given region will respond, excluding the involved agency. In that region, both of the major police departments were involved, so they actually called in the county from the neighboring region to do the investigation to try to exclude as much personnel as possible that might have some relationship with the involved officers.
And this gets to the independence idea. And so let's break it down. Breanna, this is for you. If we are looking to see if a investigation was independent, what does that mean?
So for independence, the involved agency is supposed to provide first aid to anybody at the scene. And so we're actually reviewing those narratives to see if there's any evidence that first aid was provided timely to the person who was harmed. And then they're also, the involved agency is supposed to basically call the IIT, and then once they get there, they're supposed to relinquish control of the scene, and then basically hand it over to that IIT so that they can conduct the investigation. And we just kind of look through those files just to make sure that there isn't any appearance that they were participating in the investigation as well.
What about transparency?
So the key piece regarding those rules is something called, or a person called a community representative. They're actually volunteers from the community that take part in the investigation. They're not supposed to be related to law enforcement. They're brought in just in key pieces of the investigation. They're responsible for reviewing investigators, conflict of interest assessments is what they call it, to make sure there's no connection between the investigators and the involved officers. They review the case file at the end of the investigation, and they're supposed to receive updates along the way. and they're trusted members of the community, or supposed to be trusted members of the community. And then another piece of it is that all investigation files or case files are public record. At the end, once it's submitted to the prosecutor, it's supposed to be available for public record.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the community representatives because they're an interesting and a particular bit of this. But just to finish out, like these principles we're checking on, that's independence and transparency. Communication is really specific. Like there are specific rules about communicating to the public about progress when you're talking about investigating police use of deadly force. What are we talking about there?
For communication, basically, the IITs are required to communicate to the public these press releases that go out to the media, usually weekly. And then they're also supposed to communicate that information to the family and the community representatives as well. The other thing that they're not supposed to do is release any criminal background information against the person who deadly force has been used. And those are the main communication requirements.
Credibility is a big one. What makes for a credible investigation?
So for this piece, they're really supposed to treat it as a criminal investigation. Despite the fact that there's other officers involved, they're supposed to follow all the steps that they would in any other type of investigation. So that means collecting and gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, canvassing the scene for other witnesses or surveillance footage to try to really paint an accurate picture of what happened. And there's a bunch of rules that go along with that. One thing we try to focus on is whether the investigation team and the involved agency took steps to ensure that statements given from involved officers or witnesses were given independently. I think that's a major concern amongst the public, that officers can talk to each other and then come up with a story about what happened. And there's specific rules in best practices that officers are supposed to follow. And one of them is just making sure that everyone is separated as early as possible after a shooting or another use of deadly force, and that there are steps taken to ensure they don't speak to each other before they provide statements or the investigators interview them.
Right. This is so to break that down into this particular example we're using, you can go and read our report and you'll see that after the shooting, the responding officers took each of the involved officers. So you have this independent team coming in and they separate the officers who were involved in the shooting so that they don't talk to each other. But I guess this is a good place to point out that we're talking about what later seems like a series of events, but I'm sure at the time is fairly chaotic. I mean, moments of time between when officers see someone taking out a weapon and fire, the time afterwards where first aid's maybe being provided, but the officers involved aren't supposed to be talking to each other about what just happened, which brings us into the findings. And I think we can talk a little bit here about where we identify areas to improve. Because, for example, in this episode we're talking about, this incident and investigation, one of the things are, if you go and look at the report on this, we'll say, well, during the 5-week investigation, the involved investigation team issued 6 press releases. So you're supposed to do one every week. They did 5 out of 6. That's pretty cut and dry. But can we talk a little bit about where we see noncompliance and why some of that might be? And I think the community representatives are an interesting place because, first of all, not every team recruits community representatives the same way, right? What are some of the various ways in which these teams find people from the community to be that transparency, to come in and observe as outsiders this investigation?
Yeah, so we've seen various methods that each investigation team uses or each department uses to recruit people. Some just kind of do a full outreach thing. They post in social media, newspapers, even on radio, that they're recruiting members to or volunteers to do this job. We've heard from others where the chief of the police department will ask people they know or ask people in their community to serve.
Yeah, they bring him in from, and then that sort of variety is also related to, we've seen variations in when they get involved or how they participate in the process. Some community representatives, I think, are there for a final report out to the involved agencies.
Yeah, there's various key areas that they're supposed to be involved in. One is in any briefing to the involved agency. So that was actually revised in the most recent WAC version, but for the earlier cases, the investigation team was allowed to give limited briefings to the involved agency just to explain their progress and to ensure they weren't giving additional information or that the public was aware of what information they were giving them. The community representatives were required to sit in any of those briefings. And then one thing we've typically seen was that they're always involved in like the final briefing to the prosecutor and the involved agency. Sometimes that's the only thing they do or one of the only briefings they're involved in. Other times they're pretty much briefed along the way. Some community representatives we interviewed have told them that they knew exactly what was happening the entire time. They didn't even need to review the case file at the end because they knew what happened. The commander kept them up to date. Other times, community representatives didn't even know the outcome of the investigation.
And that's part of their role, ideally, right? The goal of this system is that you have, if you, the independent investigation team, go to the county prosecutor and report out, and the community representative is not a member of law enforcement, is just listening, and they hear something that doesn't comport with their understanding of the case, they would be able to say something. That's the general theory. It's like you have somebody on the outside who's listening to this report out and trying to make sure that it jibes with the general understanding of the case. And that's, again, I think one thing I found from reading these reports, there's lots of places where things can get complicated. And just to pick another example are the conflict of interest forms. Now, everybody involved is supposed to because it's totally possible that you can bring in somebody from a different agency, but they're friends with the person involved in the shooting. So you need to check and have these conflict of interest forms, but you're talking also about potentially dozens of people involved, and they're all supposed to fill out a comprehensive questionnaire pretty quickly. So what are some of the variations you've seen there, and have any improvements been made or refinements in the guidance around that?
Yeah, so one thing we've noticed was that sometimes investigators are pulled in after the initial call out or shooting when they respond to the scene. And once they respond, that's when they typically fill out the form. They all meet for a briefing to explain what happened, why they're there, and then they fill out the form. Sometimes they're brought in a few days later, and those investigators oftentimes or sometimes don't fill one out, so they don't even have a conflict assessment. The rules also state that community representatives themselves are supposed to fill out a conflict of interest form, and a lot of times we've seen that not occur.
And I think the big thing that everybody asks us is, okay, you identified that they didn't do X, Y, or Z, or there were problems here or there. Now what? So can you explain to the folks at home where we fit into this sort of improving police accountability cycle? Like, what happens after we issue our audit?
So whenever we find areas where they're not complying with rules, we try to make a recommendation that addresses the reason. And that goes for all of the audits we do. We try to address the cause of the non-compliance. And we've made recommendations to all of the investigation teams so far, or all of the ones we've audited so far. We've also made recommendations to the Criminal Justice Training Commission where we felt like the rules were vague or needed just more guidance, or where the teams needed more guidance from them to try to improve their rules.
So I will remind everyone listening that they can go to our website to find all these reports and more information about our UDFI work at sao.wa.gov. Thank you, Michael and Breanna.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.